Okay, well, we might kick off. Now, I'm just going to check with my colleagues that I can be heard, because for some reason my screen's not doing what it normally does. How about I do that? Okay, excellent. Okay, so welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking about the impact of the economic crisis associated with COVID-19 on First Australians. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the various lands across the country on which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm sitting on Gadigal land, but I know many of you are joining from elsewhere across the country. So the purpose of these webinars has been to highlight the way that while this crisis affects us all, it also affects different people across the country differently. And one of the things that happens out of economic crises is that existing divisions, inequalities can get worse. And what we are trying to do through this webinar series is highlight some of those differential impacts and to identify some of the ways in which policymakers, but ourselves as individuals, employers, might try to ensure that the recovery, when it comes, the economic recovery, is one that doesn't entrench existing inequalities, make poverty worse, and instead is inclusive. So I'm really pleased today that we've got this wonderful panel of speakers. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll hear a presentation, and there'll be an opportunity for a conversation and some questions and answers. So start off by introducing Dr Josie Douglas. Josie is a Waterman woman from Northern Territory. She's the policy manager of the Central Land Council in the centre of Australia. And Josie's also been involved in the Aboriginal peak organisations of the Northern Territory, which has done a whole lot of work around employment for Aboriginal people across the Territory and nationally, and trying to find ways of advocating for employment in place of existing programs, which are work for the dole. We've also got Professor Nareen Young, who's a Koori woman from New South Wales. And Nareen has a long history of working in a whole variety of ways, but with workers and with corporate Australia, to look at hiring and work practices and improve prospects for diversity, but including for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And she's currently the industry professor at the Jumbunna Institute of Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney. And finally, Dr Francis Markham, who is at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the ANU. Francis recently edited a really great publication, which I recommend to you, out of CAPER about the policy implications of COVID-19, the Indigenous policy implications of COVID-19. And he's done some really important work on tracking the data around Indigenous poverty and employment. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Francis first, and he's going to take us through what we know of how the current position, and then we're going to come back and have a bit of a conversation about some of the implications from where our different panellists sit. So I'll hand over to you, Francis.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and thanks for having me here today on this panel with such illustrious colleagues. I'll throw to my slides now, hopefully. Okay, hopefully that's all coming up for you. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Canberra, where I'm dialing in from, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, their elders past and present. So I'm going to give a very brief overview. I've got 10 minutes of employment and income data for the Indigenous population. And I'm going to try and do two things. One, just to set a bit of background context. Two, to talk a little bit about diversity of these outcomes across the country. And three, then to talk about what we know coming out of the early kind of indicators coming out of COVID-19 and the current recession, which we are now in. Okay. So a little bit of background context. This slide charts the median personal incomes of Indigenous people across the country. The solid lines are for people who are in work, and the dotted lines are for the total population. And this covers a period of 16 years from 2002 to 2018. And really the main message here is twofold. One is that Indigenous incomes, median personal incomes, are very low across the country. So as you can see, those dotted lines in non-remote areas, so urban and regional areas, the median Indigenous income for an adult is about $450 a week, and it's lower still in remote areas. But as you'll be unsurprised to learn, for employed people, those incomes are higher. But the key thing is that those incomes are not only low, they've been flat for a very long time. They haven't been increasing. And despite the fact we've been in this unprecedented economic boom, really there has been very little gains in Indigenous income. And over the last 4 to 5 years, it seems there may even have been decreases, particularly in remote areas. This translates through to poverty rates. So this slide is based on the census data from 2006, 2011 and 2016. And it charts changes to the poverty rate for Indigenous people across Australia and over time. And what it shows is that Indigenous economic outcomes in terms of poverty are really diverging across the country. So in major cities, poverty rates are falling, and in inner regional areas, that's the case as well. But in remote and very remote Australia, poverty rates are increasing, and increasing very rapidly in the most remote category. So in 2016, poverty rates in very remote Australia for Indigenous people were above 50%. Now this data is a little bit noisier, but it shows the employment rate over that same 16-year time period. What it shows essentially is that in non-remote Australia, Indigenous employment has been increasing slightly and gradually over this long period of macroeconomic boom. In remote areas, the situation has been not so good, and particularly in remote areas, the abolition of the CDEP scheme, which provided community-based employment that was locally self-determined and partially Commonwealth supported. The abolition of that program between 2008 and 2014 really decreased the employment rate dramatically for Indigenous people, and there's been little prospect of recovery. And indeed, over the last 5 years in remote Australia, the employment rate has been falling in ways that are completely unrelated to the CDEP scheme, as it was already abolished in 2014-15. So the context here is that despite the long macroeconomic boom that we've seen in Australia, Indigenous employment hasn't been growing quickly. Now, this slide shows eligibility for the coronavirus supplement. And so coming now into the current crisis, what it's trying to say is that a very large proportion of Indigenous adults are in receipt of social security. And this has implications for poverty, which I've described on the previous slide. But as of, I think, 27th of April, The government introduced the coronavirus supplement, which is essentially doubled the rate of New Start, youth allowance, parenting payments. So what that has meant is that for a large proportion of social security recipients, their income is essentially doubled. And for Indigenous Australians, this means that this income doubling has happened to a really large proportion of the population. In remote areas, about 38% of the population have seen their income double, essentially, over the last month or so. And it really can't be understated the likely impact this is going to have on just basic material sustenance. There was some evidence presented earlier this week from Outback Stores, who run a number of remote community stores, who have said they've seen sales increase by, I think they said, about 80% on average across their remote stores. And so what that's saying really is that the bulk of this extra social security income has just gone into food and general household paraphernalia. Lots of people have been buying cleaning supplies, for instance, which were previously unaffordable. And so I just really want to emphasize the point that this increase to social security is much needed, long overdue, and is really the biggest poverty alleviation measure that we've seen in Indigenous Australia probably since the 1970s. That was the good news story. The bad news story is around employment. And essentially we don't have very much data at the moment about the Indigenous economic indicators during the crisis. The ABS main labour force survey, from which the unemployment rate is calculated, doesn't report Indigenous status. Centrelink haven't released Indigenous identified data at this stage. And so we're really trying to make inferences about what the impacts have been from other data. So what this slide does is it's divided up the workforce into 3 groups, depending on what industry people work in. So the most affected industries are those industries like accommodation and food services that have been really hard hit by the COVID crisis. Moderately affected industries have seen some impacts, but they haven't been as hard hit as food and accommodation, for instance, but are still struggling. And the least affected industries are those industries that are doing better than the national average. And what we can see is that as you go across those industries, Indigenous people in all 3 categories are more likely to be casually employed. And in those really highly affected industries, 60% of Indigenous workers are casually employed. So they're very likely to be fired, given what we know about the workplace situation. And even in the absence of discrimination, and we know discrimination is a big issue, we would expect Indigenous people to be harder hit by the layoffs that have come along with the COVID crisis. And Indigenous people are more likely to be casually employed across the board, even in industries which are characterised by better job security. So essentially what this slide is saying is that those economic impacts are likely to be disproportionately felt by Indigenous workers. So that's the Indigenous, non-Indigenous comparison. But even amongst the Indigenous workforce, just on the basis of that industry split, we can see that women, young people, and poorer households will be more affected by the crisis. So again, this is providing a national picture, but we can see in that first chart on the left that women are disproportionately members of the Indigenous workforce in those most affected industries, whereas men are a much larger proportion of the workforce in the more secure industries. On the second slide is the same thing, but by age bracket, and youth are hugely overrepresented in those highly affected industries. more than 50% of the Indigenous workforce in those most affected industries is under the age of 25. So we can see right away that Indigenous youth are going to be really hard hit by this crisis. And the third slide, again, breaks up those three categories of industry according to the household income of Indigenous workers. And Indigenous workers in those most affected industries have the lowest household income. So we can, holding aside the fact that Indigenous people are going to be more affected than non-Indigenous people by this crisis, it's also going to hit women, the young, and the poor most within that population. We can see, just wrapping up, one of the early indicators of this is the job active caseload, and job active is the work for the dole program in non-remote areas. And it really targets people who are unemployed or underemployed and are receiving job seeker youth allowance or parenting payment. And what the early figures from this show is that Indigenous people are roughly twice as likely to have been put out of work during this crisis or put into underemployment. Now, I need to wrap up here, but the key thing I want to leave you with is that these, even though I've been talking about the short-term impacts in terms of employment, they're going to have a very long afterlife, particularly for Indigenous youth. People who lose their job at a young age are going to find it much harder to find work in the future, and their likelihoods of getting and keeping work and getting promoted are going to be harmed for decades to come by this recession. So it's going to have a very long afterlife, particularly for the most vulnerable groups of Indigenous workers. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Francis. That's pretty sobering stuff. I'll invite the other panellists to rejoin. Look, I might just ask, I'm going to go to the other panellists with some other questions, but I might just ask for your initial responses to that sort of story. Josie, maybe you can talk to us a bit about what's been happening in Central Australia around employment and poverty, and I guess your thoughts about policy responses to date. You're on mute. Someone was always going to be talking on mute. I'm trying to unmute you. All right. I can't seem to unmute you.
How's that?
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Perfect.
Sorry about that, everybody. Well, we know that for remote Aboriginal people and communities that the gap in employment rates between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people is higher than in any other jurisdiction in the Northern Territory, and that gap is becoming wider, and that joblessness is the major driver of increasing poverty rates. What is a real concern for the Central Land Council and our constituents is that the worsening employment rates in remote areas are particularly worrying when we think about young Aboriginal people. And young people who are unable to gain any work experience and this will create a huge impact on employment prospects for decades to come. Mm-hmm. And we know that the history within particularly the Northern Territory context, that the organisational architecture to support local employment and opportunities has been absolutely decimated over the last decade in terms of CDEP being abolished and the new CDP program that people really have been suffering under. So I suppose the main thing is that in terms of addressing joblessness and poverty in remote Aboriginal communities, the focus absolutely should be on job creation and CLC, as a partner to the Aboriginal People Organisations Northern Territory, APONT, has been working really hard with a coalition across the nation on reforming CDEP, because we believe that through a better CDP program, we will get those gains in employment outcomes, and there'll be opportunities for young people in terms of traineeships. So I might just leave it at that, Lisa, just as a comment.
Yeah, so for context, for those of you who aren't employment program nerds, so you know, everyone who's unemployed, who becomes unemployed in Australia and goes on to income support, has to participate in an employment program. In non-remote areas, that's usually job active program or disability employment services or transition to work, which is the youth program. In remote areas, that is the CDP program, which typically involves 4 days a week work for the dole. So that is the program that currently operates in remote Australia. So for those of you who sort of know the job active world, that's the counterpart, but it has around twice as much work for the dole obligation as in the mainstream. One of the questions that we've got from one of our participants in the webinar is about whether there's any evidence yet about the impact of the COVID supplement on Indigenous communities, and particularly on remote Indigenous communities. I might get you, Francis, to comment on that. I think you mentioned that, and then Josie, if you can give some insights on that, would be great too. So Francis?
Yeah, sure. The short answer is no. The Department of Social Services was asked about this in the Senate yesterday, in fact, on Tuesday, and said, no, we aren't collecting any information and we don't really plan to. What we do know is sort of about particular things. So I mentioned, for instance, that the Outback Stores Group, who have 38 stores in remote Australia, they reported that their their average store revenue has gone up by about 85%, and food sales have gone up, I think they said, by about 35%, and general merchandise like white goods and household equipment has gone up by about 200%. So it's really clear that people are able to buy food, which they weren't able to do in the past, which is a pretty remarkable indicator, as well as buying those kind of essential items which are just unaffordable on $45 a day. But I suspect Josie will be able to give some more on-the-ground knowledge about how this is really affecting people's lives.
Sure. Well, everything you've just outlined is certainly true in what we're hearing from people out bush in terms of what's happening with their expenditure, with the increase in income. People are shopping at their local store, and the issue for us has been around food security. And what COVID-19 has done is absolutely magnified the issue of food security for remote communities. And this was an issue, you know, prior to COVID-19, and it's certainly been an issue during the last few months. So while people have had an increase, a doubling in their income, and have been really spending it on more fruit and veg, you know, supporting the local store a lot more, the issue has been around supply to remote stores, with, you know, in some instances empty shelves because of the how difficult it has been to source supplies due to the shortages across Australia, really. The other issue has been around the one community store that serves that community and a number of outlying outstations. And so there's been a lot of pressure on community stores, not just to provide, you know, food, but also to provide warm bedding. Winters now in Central Australia, we're having actually really cold nights and cold days. warm bedding, shoes, white goods, for example, because of the biosecurity restrictions. People weren't able to travel into urban centres or their regional town. So people were heavily reliant on their one local store for everything. And so that has been a real issue in terms of the store being able to supply the essential goods and services that people needed during the COVID-19 travel restrictions. And certainly we've done our own survey of stores, and stores have been reporting quite widely across Central Australia that there's been an increase in fruit and veg being purchased in terms of, but some issues for the smaller remote stores where, in terms of having enough stock available, you know, for 6 weeks has been the capacity of these very small stores around storage and then around fridge and freezer capacity. So, but certainly what we're hearing on the ground is that there has been an increase. People have been spending on a lot more healthy food, and fruit and veg sales have gone up.
So I'll bring Nareen in a second, but I just got one of the questions that's come up in the chat is, and I'll ask this one of you, Josie. So the questioner asks, it seems clear that professional jobs provide better security and opportunities to build wealth for presumably Aboriginal workers. Why would we keep talking about CDEP, that sort of subsidised job model, as a solution? Isn't that just a short-term fix?
I would disagree. I think it is a long-term fix. If you want to do anything to, you know, radically improve remote communities, is to reform CDEP. We, you know, in terms of, let's not. I'd just like to make the point that Indigenous people and society have been in recovery mode for the last 250 years, really, in terms of colonisation and dispossession of land, which is the basic of economic life. And a lot of remote communities only had access to education. Some of our outstations in Central Australia in the 1980s. Issues around having a really well supported bilingual education program comes into play. It's not like there's been a level playing field, or, you know, for the last few hundred years for Aboriginal people then to be able to say, well, we're going to do year 12 and we're going to go off to uni and we're going to, it's all about wealth creation. I mean, that equity just hasn't been there for many, many generations. And so it comes back to, you know, having a program that works for remote communities that is about creating jobs. There's a lot of jobs that are needed to be done on remote communities. And the mechanism to do that is through a better CDP, where people can have the actual, for the first time, the experience of work. This is just what's missing in remote life at the moment. If we don't fix this now, we're going to commit future generations to a life of not experience any work, or not, you know, not having anything available in terms of traineeships or skill development. You have to start somewhere, and this is where a whole lot of Aboriginal organisations and representative bodies are saying we need to start, and the starting point is a better CDP. And of course we want better education outcomes. This is what, you know, closing the gap is all about, but it's about Aboriginal people driving what the reform is, setting the policy priorities and being at the table to negotiate the finer detail around what's needed to improve people's lives.
So I'll hand over to Nareen now. Nareen, you know, obviously remote Australia is a very different from those to the situation in regional and urban areas, but really interested in your perspective on the sort of data that Francis has given us and where you think some of the risks are for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in other parts of the country.
I did want to endorse what Josie said about CDP first, and to me it's the policy environment could be very straightforward. It could be Aboriginal, and I had a lot to do with a lot of CDPs for a long time in New South Wales, and it just seems to me that the current approach to CDP reflects the other approaches to Indigenous employment, which is not to enable Aboriginal community control over CDP programs, and it just seems to me very straightforward. In terms of Francis' data, it's exactly what I suspected. What I'm really interested in is the gendered nature of the data in particular. What we've been finding the last few years is that more and more Indigenous employment patterns reflect standard employment practice patterns in terms of the gendered nature of employment. I would suspect that those figures come out of health, education, aged care, and hospitality and tourism v construction, and the more heavily unionised sectors with better wage outcomes that men tend to work in, including Aboriginal men and including younger Aboriginal men, as more and more of those programs emerge, of the subsidised programs. Francis' data also reflects to me, in terms of the casualised nature of the workforce, that a lot of those programs are subsidised by government, and the rate of casualisation is very high, and the level of underemployment is very high as well. So it's often 2 shifts of 4 hours a week in those kind of subsidised programs, and lots of kind of recycling people through programs of 3 months at a time rather than long-term employment approaches. So not at all surprised. I think the major policy outcome that I'd certainly be seeking at the moment is that we start to start to collect data around why people leave. We need to understand what it is that Aboriginal people want out of employment programs, and we need to start talking to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about employment programs and whether or not they're working for them. We need to be talking to the Australian recruitment industry about point of recruitment and what kind of discrimination and bias exists at point of recruitment. We need to be really looking at an overhaul of the job services industry, because it seems to me that it is simply not delivering for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I've done work with the Department of Employment on the efficiency and efficacy of the job services industry when it comes to understanding Aboriginal people and seeking proper job outcomes, long-term quality job outcomes for Aboriginal people, and it's just not there. So there are a few of the policy outcomes that I'd recommend, Lisa. I'd have a long shopping list, to be honest.
One of the specific questions that's been asked by in our question and answer panel is around the superannuation policy, so early access to superannuation and its relevance or its appropriateness to Indigenous workers or Indigenous, I guess, non-workers as well, people who've lost their jobs.
Yeah, look, this is a concept that's been around for a long time. I've been part of discussions about it around ASIC and around this, for example, the Institute of Superannuation Trustees, who would like to know more about what their Aboriginal members want, and in fact approached us earlier in the year to go and do a big survey of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members and see what people thought about this idea and other concepts around superannuation. But of course, with the government's harebrained policy of people being allowed to access their superannuation, they've taken a big hit, and it'd be interesting to know, it'd be interesting to get some data on how many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have actually taken that approach and gone into their super, because my guess would be that it'd be quite a lot, particularly if they were in employment in those casualised industries. and not able to access JobKeeper. So it's something I'd support. I think we do need to be realistic about it. It's just really straightforward. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't have as long a retirement because our people die earlier, and we know that. And so it would make sense to be able to access super earlier.
Other panellists want to comment on this one?
Yeah, look, I'd cautiously agree that, you know, a superannuation scheme is designed to allow people to sacrifice some of their income now to support them in their retirement. And picking up on Nareen's point that, you know, the life expectancy for Indigenous people is, I think, 72 years now. If you can only access your superannuation at the age of 65, the scheme's really not doing what it's designed to do for Indigenous people and really needs to be redesigned. And so, although, you know, it may have lots of flaws, I'd say that Indigenous people accessing this $10,000 now is probably not the worst thing in the world if it supports them to, say, buy a vehicle, which, you know, might have really positive consequences in their lives or the like. So, although it's probably an unintended consequence of this policy, it might be a good one. I'm doubtful about the prospects for seeing any data about this for Indigenous people because it's simply not collected by the ATO. So I'm not sure we'll ever know the story in a systematic way.
It's very interesting the way that some of these initiatives, and you were talking before, Francis, about the COVID supplement and the impact that's had. And it is almost a story about unintended consequences. The thing that you said about this is the biggest injection of funds into Indigenous communities since the 70s is on the one hand a sort of story about, wow, this is fantastic and something good would happen. And I'm hearing anecdotal stuff about, you know, the renewed energy in local economies such as they are, just because people have got a bit of money to spend. But how crazy is that? That these initiatives that are designed to help people in their hour of crisis, of need, because we have this unprecedented event, is the opportunity to give people, to alleviate what is entrenched poverty. So I think that, you know, it's the sort of, there's something about the size of that gap and the difference between the living circumstances of so many Aboriginal families and what most Australians expect, that makes these policies play out in quite a different way. And perhaps what it means is that some of us are beginning, at least have got a taste of unemployment in a way that is business as usual in so many.
I think, Lisa, what it raises for me is what's going to happen in September when it all stops. And I think that is of real concern in terms of people going, and the family members who were able to access casual work may still not be able to access casual work. So that, except in the construction sector, and that doesn't happen everywhere, and it certainly doesn't happen in Josie's type area. So that to me is of real concern, and one of the things that needs some considered policy responses.
So I was going to ask just a comment there's a comment in the Q&A that in the East Kimberley there's increased inquiries from Aboriginal people about their accessing superannuation. So that reinforces what you guys are saying. Wanted also, I guess, to ask a question, particularly of you, Josie. So one of the default responses of governments in these times is to say, right, we're going to throw some money at large-scale infrastructure projects. We're going to throw some money at housing construction. So we've seen the sort of, you know, the money for renovations and new home building. And I guess I'm, you know, interested in your thoughts about, you know, what is the relevance of those for communities in your area, and what's the relevance of those for your communities?
I think that large investment in terms of providing a stimulus to the economy, we shouldn't forget about a stimulus package for remote, and infrastructure packages are fantastic for some in terms of those companies who can put the tender in, who can demonstrate in terms of their Aboriginal employment outcomes, but we know that a lot of those will be short-term casual contracts, that people get skilled up for the duration of that infrastructure project, and then it comes to an end. So certainly we'd be advocating for a remote jobs package that's made available to Aboriginal community controlled organisations, a fund, for want of a better word, where local organisations can apply to this fund and clearly articulate what jobs are needed in their community, whether it's in aged care, healthcare, childcare. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So the infrastructure projects is one thing, but let's not forget about, you know, the ongoing everyday work that has a longer lifespan than the 3 months contract of a project or a 6 months. Let's have a 5-year economic stimulus jobs package for remote Australia. I think that would make an incredible difference.
So I know we've got one of our participants, Dennis Batty. Dennis works with a number of employers in Indigenous Employment Partners, a social enterprise down in Victoria. Dennis, have we got you? I think you had some reflections on what you're seeing in this environment. Hopefully, this is where the sort of the live TV moment sort of happens.
Hi, Lisa. I'm not sure what's going on. I don't have any vision.
Oh, well, we can hear you though. That's great, Dennis. Thanks.
I will try again. Here we go.
Excellent.
Finally. So yeah, I guess I'm listening particularly to what Francis has been saying, and our experience has almost mirrored the stuff that he's brought up. What we found coming into, particularly into COVID, and I'll talk about that, is we got a lot of very angry job seekers, people coming into employment who were saying, well, our previous employer seriously doesn't take their Aboriginal employment strategy or their diversity and inclusion strategy seriously. We were basically last on, first off. The upshot of that was we don't want to go back to our previous employer, and we want to rethink what we're doing, and we want to work in areas where we want to work. So we've found people who for example, were working for a dentist who now want to work in education, and so they want to train there. One who was previously working driving construction equipment who wants to be a diesel mechanic. So we've got an overwhelming number of people who are actually going through that and thinking, this is an opportunity for us to rethink who we are in terms of our employment. What we're seeing, and for example now, and this almost exactly mirrors what Francis said. So we've placed 10 people in the last week, and it's the first time we've placed people for a long time. Of those 10, 4 are in permanent positions and 6 are casual. And they're 6 casual positions with employers who previously would have hired people permanently. So there's an interesting trend there. So I think we will see coming out of this an increased casualisation of the labour market, and that will hit Aboriginal people, hit us harder than anybody else, I suspect. The other thing that Francis raised that we are seeing a lot of as well is, and Josie raised, is the issue of women in the workforce, and particularly Aboriginal women in the workforce, in lower paid and increasingly casualised roles. So that, for example, of those 10 we placed in the last week, typically, previously, it might have been split 60-40. We've only placed 1 woman. So out of 10 people, only 1 of them was a woman in the last week. And it's not that they were particularly in roles that didn't suit women. In fact, probably all of them, I'd argue, were in roles that women would have been suited to. But because when we put them up and we put men up against them, when we shortlisted, employers went for men. and I can't comment on why particularly that
Gee,
is.
what a surprise, Dennis.
Yeah, it actually did surprise me. I was shocked that it was, like, we're talking 90%. It shocked me that it was that high. So I guess so that's what I was talking about. They're the trends we're seeing. The other trend we are now seeing coming from our employers, and we have we've got a base of about 70 employers that we work with. We're not government funded. We're not a job active. We're a direct recruitment agency who only deals in placing Aboriginal people. Increasingly, what the message we're getting coming out of this from these employers is, we do not want to work with job actives. We don't trust them. They don't meet our needs when it comes to Aboriginal recruitment and when it comes to working with Aboriginal people. So that doesn't, I think, bode well for the future as well in terms of job actives being able to place Aboriginal people in employment. If you've got employers going, well, you know what, we've now got a lot more options out there, and we would rather not work with job actives unless we absolutely have to. So I guess they're the major trends that we're beginning to see already.
Right. So, thanks so much for that, Dennis. You've raised some of these really important issues, and it's interesting with Scott Morrison talking about tradies, and there's this focus on men's jobs, and I have no issue with trying to make sure we've got a vibrant construction industry and all of those things. But what we've seen from the data is that it's actually women's jobs that women are highly affected, disproportionately affected. And as you say, Janice, they're much more likely to be underemployed and in casual roles than men. So there's a question there about how we avoid entrenching that in the policies that we come out with. So I've got another question here from one of our Q&A people. We're doing better at trying to get to some of these questions this time, so that's really good. And then I'm going to come back to panelists to talk about policy solutions going forward. So one of the questions is around the role of VET and access to the vocational education and training sector. So one of the things that certainly in the world that I move in, there's a lot of talk about, well, if the economy is going to be in trouble for the next few years, is this an opportunity for people to get more skills, to enrol in vocational qualifications, to upgrade their skills? So I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about access to vocational education and training, and how you see that playing out in terms of Indigenous employment prospects. And I'll start with you, Josie, I think, on this one.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, I absolutely agree that access to VET is crucial. It's a real issue for remote communities and probably even regional as well. There's just the lack of providers within the Northern Territory, the lack of diversity, the cost effectiveness of providing a VET that's place-based and delivered at the local level. It's not cost effective for the VET provider. It's a huge issue, and I think one that I really believe that the Commonwealth has to step in and do a bit more when it comes to remote Aboriginal communities across Australia and access to VET. It's an issue that we need to fix if we're going to, have any improvements.
Nareen, did you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I do. And just in terms of that gendered nature of what VET courses are available, it seems to me also that that's another area where apprenticeships is something that we should be discussing as well. But again, that kind of the way that the construction industry has been able to flourish during this period and keep going has meant that there will be more access to VET courses by men. And we're not looking at for instance, the community health sector or the aged care sector, where women tend to work, in a way that is about building careers and therefore access to vet. As Josie said, the federal government really needs to step in now. What we've seen over the last 10 years, as you all know, is an absolute neglect of the vet system in terms of funding, and the skills shortage, which Aboriginal people could be filling, is testament to that. I think that it's now the perfect time to apply a lot of policy pressure around building up the vet sector again, so that our people do get access to quality careers and are able to form careers in the industries that are flourishing. And we know what they are. They're the disability sector, they're the aged care sector, they're the health sector, they're the construction sector. And hospitality and tourism will come back. It's just a temporary thing around that. And it's really hard to get access to vet now. And it's not something, and I'm sure Dennis would be able to reinforce this, it's not something employers offer and think about when they employ new people. It's all about getting that bum on the seat and not about skills acquisition or development or working towards things that provide career development. So we need to change that mindset. I'd also be interested to know, in the job services and job active approach is one that also is about job acquisition and not long-term job security or skills development, and that needs to go into the thinking around an overhaul of the job services industry as well.
Yes, it's precise. And in fact, in CDP, it's even more extreme, because you can't use vet training as your work for the dole activity.
That's right.
So you know, there is an absolute priority given to a job, and not participation in getting vocational education. Francis, did you want to comment on that? No. So look, I think we're I don't know, we've got a little bit more time. That's really terrific. So I wanted to get you guys to just talk about what you'd like to see next. So what we've heard, I think, is, or what we know about economic crises is that if you go in bad shape, then there's a good chance that things are going to get tougher unless we do something about it. And I think that, you know, Dennis's comments reminded us that the private sector for the next few years, for the, you know, at least, will be very cautious in putting on permanent employees, very cautious on putting on apprentices, very cautious on making long-term commitments. So we're really going to have to look to the public sector to really drive an employment boom. But we hope also that employers will private employers will play a part in it. So I'm interested in getting from each of you a bit of a sense of what you think needs to happen next to avoid the gap widening as a result of this economic recovery, rather than, you know, how can we actually grow back better, come back better out of the recovery? And I'll start with you, Francis, on this one.
So I could talk for half an hour about this, but I'll keep it short. The first thing is, it's been clearly recognised by the Commonwealth Government that social security rates before the crisis were unlivably low. They're a poverty trap, that they're so low that they stop people from being able to transition into the workforce. And that's been recognised in this temporary increase to payment levels. That needs to be made permanent. It's really so hard to get into the workforce when you're living in such entrenched poverty. So that needs to change. And the second point I'd make is around employment services, employment more generally. I think we actually really need a re-architecture of that system in Australia. It was failing Indigenous people before the crisis. Now we're in this crisis where there's just so many people out of work, so much competition for jobs. Indigenous people are already disadvantaged in the labour market for structural reasons. They're already discriminated against through interpersonal racism. And without major changes, there's going to be really long-lasting impacts on Indigenous people's lives that will last for decades. And so I think we really need a re-architecture of the employment services system, We need much more direct government investment in jobs, whether that's an expansion of the public sector. It's not the time to be shrinking the public sector. It's time to be expanding the public sector and creating public service jobs. And it's time to be funding social enterprises and Indigenous organisations to be providing the kind of services that are desperately needed in communities, and providing work for people who desperately need work.
Nareen, I'm going to ask you next, but also one of the questions in the chat box was around the role of corporate Australia. What can corporate Australia do?
Yeah, I saw that. Well, it's always an interesting question, and there's a tension between the people who say that corporate Australia needs to pay its rent by employing Indigenous people, and those who say that programs supporting Indigenous people need to be part of diversity practice. So I consider that both approaches are important, because we can learn from diversity practice and the things that it hasn't done and the things that it hasn't delivered. I think if you really have a good look, corporate Australia is in fact playing its part. I think the latest report from Reconciliation Australia said something like there's 35,000 people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I was never a fan of the RAP approach, but I have become one in the employment context, because those targets do tend to be reached. Whether or not they provide quality long-term jobs or not remains to be seen. And again, we can never get any data on what's happening in corporate Australia. But I think there's a lot of corporates that are playing their part, not doing as well as I'd like them to do in terms of promotions in particular, but I think there can always be more. I think one of the things we need to start talking about in terms of corporate Australia long-term is subsidised employment, and when they're going to start actually paying for Indigenous people themselves, rather than constantly having government propping them up. In terms of what I'd see as a long-term solution, I think I endorse everything Francis said. I think we need to be looking to a full employment model, and to be looking to implement that by whatever means we can in the public sector and by way of public intervention, but that within that, Aboriginal people, we finally give proper attention to all of the different ways that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people want to work, and that we ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people what it is that they want and what they want to do. Dennis's comments in that context were really interesting about what people want to do. We often have the kind of colonialist approach, it seems to me, is non-Aboriginal people talking about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should do without giving consideration to what people might want to do. So I think we need to, and I like Francis' terminology in terms of, I say, an overhaul of the employment services industry, the architecture of that industry. It is simply not delivering. Most of the organisations that I work with the large organisations that recruit a lot of Aboriginal people have their own recruitment teams. They don't, as Dennis said, want to rely on the job services sector at all. They have increasingly Aboriginal recruitment teams who, because there's a bit of competition really for Aboriginal graduates, for example, so they have teams of Aboriginal people recruiting, even in the unskilled, low-skilled, low-pay sector, because you just cannot rely on the job services sector. So they're my thoughts, but I could also talk about it all day. So I'll give it a rest now.
And we're out of time. So a quick comment from Josie, and then we'll wrap up. It's been such a great conversation. I wish I could spend all afternoon, but probably people got jobs to do. Josie, your final thoughts?
Well, just briefly on what can corporate Australia do? Well, absolutely, they can inform themselves in terms of what the Aboriginal, representative bodies are advocating for around employment, inform themselves, be briefed, and then lend their muscle, I think, really to the advocacy policy priorities of Aboriginal communities when it comes to remote, and what can be done to fix remote. Not fix it, but to provide more job and creation opportunities, and especially for young people. Otherwise, we're just committing this generation and future generations to, you know, not being able to experience what it feels like to work, and people do want to work.
Look, thank you so much for that conversation. That was really terrific. And I just think it's really important that we make sure that as more and more people join the job queue and really experience unemployment for the first time and will be upset and loud about it, that we make sure that issues about distribution of opportunity, of wealth to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people just stays on the agenda. So I hope that this has contributed to that, and I'll thank you very much for that, you know, what a wonderful conversation, and to our participants who asked many fabulous questions. Thank you. The slides and the videos will be sent out to all participants in the program today, so you'll get a copy. Okay, thanks guys. Have a lovely evening. Bye.